My name is Kwame, and like many of you, I have striven to follow God, but my journey has been marked by doubt, by questions too heavy for my soul to carry alone. I grew up in the church, listening to the elders speak of faith, of obedience, of salvation. But something always tugged at me, a whisper in the night that I could not ignore. If we were truly God's children, why had we suffered so much? Why had our history been twisted, our voices silenced? I asked these questions in secret, afraid they would betray my faith, but they never left me. My grandmother was the first to tell me that God spoke in many ways. Through the wind in the trees, through the rhythm of the drum, through the quiet wisdom of our ancestors. She would sit by the fire at night and tell stories of a time before, of a people who walked with God long before others claimed to have brought him to us. "Do not forget who you are," she would say. "They will try to tell you that you were lost before they came, but God was always with us." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to hold on to that truth, but the world outside our small village had a different story. History books painted Africa as a place of darkness before the missionaries arrived, as if we had never known the light. Sermons in the city churches carried an unspoken message, that our ways, our traditions, were remnants of something less pure, something less worthy. And so, I lived between two worlds, caught between the faith of my people and the faith I was taught to accept. Then came the day everything changed. It was an ordinary afternoon, the sun high in the sky, the air thick with the scent of the earth after the morning rain. I was traveling back from the market, a simple journey I had taken countless times before. But fate, or perhaps something greater, had other plans. The truck came out of nowhere, metal screaming against metal, my body flung like a leaf caught in a storm. There was pain, but only for a moment. Then silence. A silence so complete it felt like the world had ceased to exist. I was floating, weightless, as if I had been freed from the heaviness of flesh. Around me a golden light pulsed, warm and alive, wrapping me in a peace I had never known. And then I saw him, Jesus. But not as the paintings had shown him, not the pale-faced man with sorrowful eyes I had seen in churches. He stood before me, his presence a force that made the very air tremble. His skin was like bronze, his hair thick like wool, his eyes burning with something beyond human understanding. Love. Power. Truth. I fell to my knees not because I was afraid, but because in that moment I understood. I had always known him and he had always known me. "Kwame," he spoke, his voice like music, like thunder, like the first breath of creation. "Rise." I stood, though I did not know how. There was no weight in this place, no pain, no fear, only knowing. "You have questions," he said, his gaze piercing through me. "Ask." And so I did. The questions that had haunted me, the doubts I had never dared speak aloud. Why had we suffered? Why had our history been erased? Why had we been told we were lost before others found us? Jesus looked at me, and in his eyes I saw sorrow, not for us, but for the lies we had been made to believe. "You were never lost," he said. "You were never forgotten. My father walked with your fathers, your mothers, long before the world tried to rewrite the truth. Africa was not forsaken, it was chosen." I trembled, the weight of his words sinking deep into my soul. "But why? Why have we been told otherwise?" "Because the world fears what it does not understand," he said. "Because power seeks to control and truth is a threat to those who wish to rule. But listen to me, Kwame, and remember, your people have always carried my light. From the beginning, from the time of Abraham, from the time of Moses. Ethiopia, Egypt, Cush. These names are written in my book, not as footnotes but as pillars of my story. My blood flows through you as surely as it flowed through them. Tears burned my eyes. All my life, I had felt like an outsider to the story of faith, as if we were invited late to a table that had been set for others. But now, standing before the Son of God, I saw the truth. We had been at the table all along. "Then what must I do?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Tell them," he said. Tell my people that they are called, that they are seen, that they are loved. The world has tried to break them, to strip them of their name, their heritage, their power. But I am restoring what was lost. Africa will rise, not in the way the world expects, but in the way my Father has ordained. A great awakening is coming, and your people will lead it. A great awakening. The words echoed in my soul, stirring something ancient, something deep. I wanted to stay, to bask in his presence, to ask more, to understand more. But even as I opened my mouth, I felt myself being pulled away, the light fading, the warmth slipping from my grasp. I gasped, my lungs burning as air rushed back into them. The world was loud again, too bright, too heavy. Voices shouted around me, hands pressed against my skin, the scent of blood and earth filling my nostrils. I was alive, but I was not the same. I lay there staring at the sky, my mind still caught between two worlds. The pain in my body told me I was back, but my soul had touched something beyond time, beyond flesh. The voices around me were urgent, calling my name, pressing me to stay awake, but I could hardly hear them. My heart was pounding with a different urgency, not of survival, but of revelation. I had seen him. I had spoken with him, and what he had revealed, what he had told me about my people, about Africa, was something I could never forget. The days that followed felt like walking in a dream. My body healed, but my spirit burned. I could not rest. The words Jesus had spoken replayed in my mind again and again. You were never lost. You were never forgotten. Africa was not forsaken, it was chosen. But how could I tell them? How could I make them believe? I returned to my village, expecting to find comfort, expecting to find understanding. But when I spoke of what I had seen, some looked at me with awe, others with fear. The elders listened in silence, their faces unreadable. My mother wept, saying that God had spared me for a reason. My friends whispered among themselves, unsure whether I had truly seen heaven or whether the accident had left my mind shaken. The pastor at our church invited me to speak, but when I shared my vision, I could see the discomfort in his eyes. "Brother Kwame," he said gently, "it is good that you have returned to us, and I do not doubt that God has spoken to you. But we must be careful not to let personal visions take us beyond the teachings we have been given." I wanted to scream. Had we been so conditioned to see ourselves as outsiders to God's plan that we could not even recognize his voice when it called to us? Frustration weighed on me. But then, I remembered Jesus' words. The world has tried to break them, to strip them of their name, their heritage, their power. But I am restoring what was lost. I did not need them to believe me. I needed only to speak the truth. The rest was in God's hands, so I began. I traveled to other villages, speaking to anyone who would listen. I told them of my encounter, of the truth that had been hidden from us. I told them that we were not the forgotten, not the afterthoughts of faith, but part of the very foundation of God's story. I spoke of Ethiopia, of Cush, of the men and women of our bloodline who had walked with God long before colonizers claimed to bring him to us. Some scoffed, some turned away. But others, others knew. The elders who still remembered the old stories, the ones passed down before they were replaced with foreign tongues, nodded in agreement. The scholars who had studied beyond what was taught in churches came forward with scriptures to support what I had seen. And the young, listened with a hunger I had never seen before. They had always known there was more. Now they had found it, but with revelation comes resistance. The whispers of warning began to spread. I was stirring dangerous thoughts, they said. I was leading people down a path that was not sanctioned by the church. Some called me a heretic. Others said I was being deceived. Invitations that once came freely were now withdrawn. Some doors were closed to me, and some friends no longer walked beside me. And yet, the more they tried to silence me, the more the truth spread. It was not just me. Others began to dream, to see visions, to remember the old prayers and the old ways, not in defiance of God, but in unity with him. Something was awakening, something powerful, something divine. And then one night, as I sat by the river in prayer, the wind shifted. A presence filled the air, wrapping around me like fire and water at once. My heart pounded, my breath caught, and then I heard him again. It has begun. I wept, because I knew the awakening was here. The days that followed were unlike anything I had ever known. It was as if the very air around us had changed, as if heaven itself was watching, waiting, moving. Those who had once hesitated now came with questions, seeking understanding, seeking truth. They had felt it too, the stirring in their bones, the whisper in their dreams. And yet opposition grew. Word had spread beyond our villages, beyond our towns. Some church leaders spoke against me, warning their congregations not to be led astray. Others sent men to challenge me openly, to call me deceived, to demand that I prove myself. But how could I prove what had already been written? The scriptures had always been there, hidden in plain sight. Africa was not some forgotten land on the outskirts of God's kingdom. It was there from the beginning, Eden stretching into Cush, prophets seeking refuge in Egypt, the Queen of Sheba standing before Solomon, the Ethiopian eunuch baptized on the desert road. How had we forgotten, or rather, who had made us forget? One night, I found myself standing before a crowd larger than any I had spoken to before. The village square was full. The faces of young and old turned toward me, their eyes filled with both hope and fear. Torches flickered in the darkness, casting shadows across the faces of men who had come not to listen, but to accuse. "You claim to have seen Jesus," one of them said, his voice laced with skepticism. "Then tell us, what proof do you bring? What sign do you show?" I could have answered with scripture. I could have spoken of prophecy. But the fire in my spirit burned hotter than debate. So instead, I lifted my hands to the sky and spoke the words that had been seared into my soul. We were never lost. A wind stirred through the crowd, sudden and fierce, carrying the scent of rain though the sky had been clear. Gasps rippled through them as the torches flickered, not out but higher, as if the flames had been fed by the very breath of God. The elders stepped forward, their faces unreadable, but their eyes alight with something ancient, something knowing. One of them, a man who had always sat in silence during my teachings, finally spoke. "It is time," he said. "The old stories must be remembered." And so they were. Stories that had been whispered by our ancestors, hidden beneath the weight of colonization and conquest, began to rise again. Stories of a faith that had existed long before foreign missionaries arrived. Stories of kings and prophets, of prayers spoken in languages that had once been declared lost. And in those stories, we found our truth. The resistance did not stop. In fact, it grew stronger. Those who had built power on the belief that we were outsiders to God's plan did not take kindly to the truth. There were threats. There were warnings. Some doors closed forever, but others burst open. Men and women who had once doubted now stood beside me. Communities that had long felt abandoned by God now knew they had never been forgotten. The movement spread, not just in our village but beyond, touching lands and people I had never even met. And then, one night, as I knelt in prayer beneath the stars, the voice came again. "The chains are breaking." I wept because I knew what had begun as a single revelation was no longer just my burden to carry. The truth had taken root, and no force on this earth, no lie, no power, no empire could stop what God had set in motion. Africa was awakening. The awakening spread like fire, unstoppable and undeniable. From village to village, city to city, voices rose with a new certainty, a new conviction. The weight that had pressed upon us for generations, the weight of being told we were mere footnotes in God's grand design, began to lift. We were not just participants in faith. We were woven into its very foundation. But with truth comes battle. Not all celebrated what was happening. Those in power, spiritual, political, even academic, grew uneasy. For centuries, they had controlled the narrative, deciding which histories were told and which were buried. They had dictated our identity, crafting a version of faith that kept us grateful but never truly empowered. They sent scholars to challenge me, theologians to argue, pastors to rebuke. Some came with genuine questions, seeking understanding. Others came with accusations, their hearts hardened before they had even heard a word. "You preach rebellion," one man declared in a crowded hall where I had been invited to speak. "You divide the body of Christ with dangerous teachings." "The gospel is for all people, not just one race." I met his gaze, steady and unafraid. "And yet, for generations, it was you who divided us. It was you who erased our names from the story, who taught us to see ourselves as guests at the table instead of rightful sons and daughters. Now, when the truth returns, you call it rebellion." The murmurs in the room grew. Some nodded in agreement, others scowled. But the truth had been spoken, and truth, once revealed, cannot be undone. But it was not only men of the cloth who opposed us. The governments took notice. There were whispers that I was dangerous, that I was stirring unrest. Invitations that once came freely were now revoked. Old friends distanced themselves. I received warnings that if I did not stop, there would be consequences. But how could I stop? How could I silence the truth that had burned itself into my very soul? And then, one night they came. It was past midnight when I awoke to the sound of footsteps outside my door. A chill ran through me, but I did not move. I had seen this moment before, not in dreams, not in visions, but in the knowing that had settled into my bones from the moment I returned. The door burst open. Shadows filled the room. Rough hands seized me, dragged me from my bed, forced me into the cold night air. There were no explanations, no charges, only the unspoken warning in their eyes. "You have said too much." They threw me into a dark cell, a place where voices did not carry and light dared not enter. Days passed, how many I did not know. Hunger gnawed at me. My body weakened. But my spirit, oh my spirit, was unshaken, and in that darkness he came again, not in light this time, not in the blinding radiance of heaven, but in a whisper, soft yet unyielding, like the roots of an ancient tree breaking through stone. "Do not be afraid." Tears filled my eyes. "Lord, they will kill me. They cannot kill what I have set free." And then I saw it, Africa rising, not in rebellion, not in war, but in truth. Chains, chains of the mind, chains of identity, chains of history, shattered into dust. A people who had been told they were nothing, standing in the fullness of who they were always meant to be. A people no longer begging for a place at the table, but reclaiming the inheritance that had always been theirs. The vision faded, but the certainty remained. The next morning the guards came. They dragged me from my cell, their faces unreadable. But as we stepped outside, I saw something that made my breath catch. A crowd, hundreds, no thousands, had gathered, standing in the streets, refusing to move. Their faces were not filled with fear, but with fire, with knowing, with the same unshakable truth that had been placed in me. And at the front the elders stood, the same elders who had once listened in silence, who had once hesitated to believe. Now they stood as witnesses, as protectors. The guards hesitated. The crowd did not. A single voice rose, then another and another, until the air trembled with the sound of a people who had remembered who they were. I was free, not because they released me, but because I had never been bound. And as I stepped forward, as I looked into the eyes of my people, I knew the world would never be the same again. The battle did not end that day. If anything, it had only begun. They thought fear would silence me. They thought threats, imprisonment, and exile would break me. But how could I be broken when I had already died? How could I be silenced when the voice that spoke through me was not my own? The revelation had taken root, and no force on earth could uproot what God had planted. The movement spread beyond the borders of my homeland. Word traveled faster than I ever could, carried by those who had heard and seen the truth with their own eyes. From villages to cities, from the hidden places to the open streets, the fire of awakening swept across nations. I met elders who had held onto fragments of this truth for generations, waiting for the day it would rise again. I met young men and women who had always sensed that something was missing from the version of history they had been given. I met scholars who had been silenced, preachers who had been cast out, families who had suffered for daring to remember. But now we were not alone. The world began to take notice. Articles were written, debates ignited, accusations hurled. Some called it a heresy. Others called it a revolution. But those who knew, those who understood, called it what it was, restoration. And with restoration came war. Not the kind fought with swords and blood, but the kind that raged in the hearts of men. The kind that threatened systems built on deception. The kind that made the powerful tremble, because they knew that a people who had found their identity could never be enslaved again, physically, mentally, or spiritually. And so they fought back. Churches barred their doors to me. Governments labeled me a radical. Friends I had known my whole life turned away, afraid to be seen standing beside me. I was watched. I was followed. I was warned that another imprisonment would not be so merciful. And then, one night, the dream came. I stood in a great hall, a place unlike anything I had ever seen before. Pillars stretched to the sky, adorned with carvings older than memory itself. Golden light poured in from unseen windows, casting a warmth that seeped into my very soul. And before me stood Jesus. His eyes, oh those eyes, held all the sorrow and all the joy of eternity. They saw through me into me, as if reading every word that had ever been written into my soul. "My Lord," I whispered, falling to my knees. But he reached out, lifting me up with a touch that sent fire through my veins. "Stand." I rose, trembling. "They fight against me. They call me deceived. They say I bring division." His expression did not change. Did they not say the same of me? Tears burned my eyes. "What do I do?" He gestured behind me, and I turned. There, stretching as far as my eyes could see, were people. Not just my people, not just my nation, but all nations. Africans, yes, but also those who had descended from Africa yet forgotten their roots. Those scattered by war, by chains, by history rewritten by the conqueror's hand. And among them stood others, men and women of different lands, different tongues, yet drawn to the same truth. A body, broken and divided for centuries, now reaching for restoration. "This is not just about you," Jesus said. "Not just about one people, but it begins with those who have been forgotten." I turned back to him, my heart pounding. "Then what is required of me?" His gaze softened, but his voice held the weight of eternity. "Speak. Do not stop. Do not bow. Do not fear. The ones who listen will rise, and the ones who rise will awaken the world." The vision faded. The dream ended. But when I awoke, my body burned with purpose. I understood now. This was never just about history. It was never just about identity. It was about restoration. About a world that had been fractured and could not be healed until the missing pieces were found. I knew from that moment on that the cost of this truth would be high. That some would rather die than accept it. That I would lose much, perhaps everything. But I also knew this. The chains had already been broken. The lies had already been exposed. The truth had already taken root. And there was no force in heaven or on earth that could stop what God had begun. The days that followed were not easy. The world did not change overnight, nor did those who clung to old lies suddenly see the light. If anything, the opposition grew stronger. Threats turned into action. My name was blacklisted. My accounts frozen. Invitations that once poured in suddenly dried up, and places that had welcomed me now pretended they had never known me. And yet, something greater was happening. People whispered my name in the streets, not in fear but in hope. Messages flooded in from across the world from those who had received the revelation and could not keep it to themselves. I always knew something was missing. Now I finally understand. This has changed my life, my family, my faith. I see God differently now. They called me crazy, but now I know I am not alone. It was no longer just my voice. It was an army rising. I traveled from village to village, town to town, speaking wherever I was welcomed. Sometimes that meant grand halls filled with eager listeners. Other times it meant secret gatherings in the dead of night, whispers in dark corners where light could not yet reach. Everywhere I went, I saw the same hunger in their eyes, the hunger to know, to reclaim, to rise. And then, one day, the vision came again. I was standing at the edge of a great river, its waters dark and endless. Across from me, I could see a land vast and golden, stretching beyond sight. I turned, and there he was, Jesus. His robe was white, but it held the colors of the earth within it. His hair, like wool, shone under a light that had no source. His eyes, those eyes, held the weight of eternity. He gestured toward the river. "You see?" he asked. I swallowed hard. "See what, Lord? The crossing is before you, but many will not step forward. They fear what they do not know." I looked back at the river, its waters shifting like liquid shadow. Why do they fear? Because they have been told the river is death. They have been told there is nothing beyond it. Tears welled in my eyes. But I have seen. I know what is beyond it. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "Then tell them, show them, lead them." The river began to part, and I saw the path, narrow, winding, but firm beneath my feet. "Not all will follow," he said. "Not all will believe, but those who do will never be the same." I turned to him, my heart pounding. "And if they try to stop me?" His eyes burned like fire. "Who can stand against the one I have sent?" The vision shattered, and I awoke with a gasp. My body trembled, my soul alight with the weight of his words. I understood. The time had come. No more waiting. No more whispers. The world would hear the truth. And nothing, no fear, no power, no force of darkness, could silence what had been set into motion. I stood at the threshold of destiny, knowing there was no turning back. The weight of revelation burned in my chest like a fire shut up in my bones. I could no more contain it than the sun could refuse to rise. And so I spoke. I spoke in marketplaces, where merchants paused their haggling to listen. I spoke in churches, where some wept and others stormed out in anger. I spoke in homes, where families gathered in secret, afraid but desperate for truth. Some received it with joy, their hearts ignited as if they had always known but had never been given the words. Others rejected it with fury, their faces contorted with fear, because the truth threatened everything they had built their lives upon. And then there were those who watched from the shadows. I felt their eyes long before they made themselves known. Men in suits. Officials who asked too many questions. Religious leaders who whispered warnings behind closed doors. One evening, after a gathering where the Spirit had moved so powerfully that people fell to their knees, a man approached me. He was older, dressed in a fine robe, and his eyes carried the weight of authority. "You must stop," he said simply. I met his gaze. "I cannot. You do not understand what you are doing. I understand more than you think." He sighed, looking past me as if searching for the right words. "Do you think you are the first? Do you think others have not seen what you have seen, have not tried to speak as you do? Where are they now?" I asked. A flicker of pain crossed his face. "Buried, forgotten, their voices lost to time." I took a step closer. "Then I will be different." He studied me for a long moment before shaking his head. "They will come for you, and when they do, you will wish you had stayed silent. But I had already died once. What more could they do to me?" I left that night with my heart steady, my mind clear. The warning did not frighten me. It confirmed what I already knew. The enemy does not attack what does not threaten him. Days passed, then weeks. The pressure mounted. The opposition grew. Some who had once walked with me now turned away, afraid of what my name had come to mean, and then they came. It was late when the knock sounded at my door. Not a friendly knock, a warning knock, a final knock. I opened it to find men dressed in dark suits, their expressions unreadable. "You must come with us," one of them said. For a brief moment my heart wavered, but then I remembered. I had stood before the King of Kings. I had walked in the halls of eternity. I had seen what was beyond the river. What could these men do to me? I stepped forward, unafraid. "If this is the cost of truth," I said, "then so be it." And with that, I walked into the unknown, knowing that whatever lay ahead, the story was far from over. They led me through dimly lit corridors, the air heavy with the scent of mildew and something darker, fear perhaps, or the residue of secrets long kept hidden. My footsteps echoed, a solitary sound in the silence that pressed around us like a shroud. We descended deeper, the walls closing in until we reached a narrow room with a single, flickering bulb casting shadows that danced like specters. The men gestured for me to sit. In the corner stood a figure, half hidden in shadow, his presence a cold weight on the air. He stepped forward, revealing a face lined with age and eyes that spoke of battles fought in places unseen. "Kwame," he began, his voice soft but laced with steel, "do you know who I am?" I met his gaze, unwavering. "No, but I know what you represent," he smiled, a thin, sharp thing devoid of warmth. "Then you know why you are here." "I am here because truth threatens those who thrive on lies." His smile faltered. "You believe you've found some grand revelation, some hidden knowledge that justifies this chaos you've sown. But you are a danger, not just to yourself, but to all who listen to you." "A danger?" I asked, incredulous. "To whom?" "To those who have built kingdoms on the backs of the oppressed. To those who rewrite history to suit their power. To order," he snapped, his calm facade breaking. "To peace." The word stung, a bitter irony. "Peace built on silence is no peace at all," he paced, hands clasped behind his back. "You speak of Africa as though it is chosen, special, different. Yet, what has your so-called revelation brought you? Rejection, isolation, imprisonment. Can't you see that the very people you claim to elevate will suffer for your pride?" His words were blades seeking to cut at the heart of my mission. But I stood unbroken. "Suffering comes not from truth, but from those who fear it." He stopped, the shadow of a man caught between duty and doubt. "We are giving you one last chance. Recant. Deny what you have claimed. Return to your village and live out your days in peace." Silence hung heavy between us, the air thick with anticipation. I looked into his eyes and saw the weight of his choices, the burden of a life spent in service to a cause that perhaps even he did not fully understand. And then I spoke the words that had been etched into my soul. "I have seen the Son of God. I have walked in his light, felt his truth. How can I deny what has been branded into my spirit by the fire of the Almighty?" His face hardened, the last flicker of mercy extinguished. "Then you leave us no choice." They took me deeper into the bowels of that place, into a cell where the air was thin and the darkness complete. The door slammed shut, the echo a grim punctuation to the warning they hoped would break me. Days bled into nights, time losing its meaning in that tomb of concrete and steel. Hunger gnawed at my belly, thirst clawed at my throat, but still I prayed. And in that darkness he came to me again. Not in a vision, not in a dream, but in a whisper that curled through the gloom like smoke. "Even here I am with you." Tears slipped down my cheeks, mingling with the dust and the despair. "Lord," I whispered, "will this be my end?" "No," he answered, the word a balm to my soul. "For you are not alone. As I was with your fathers and mothers, so am I with you. The world may try to silence you, but my word will never return void." Strength flowed into me, lifting my weary heart, filling my lungs with breath renewed. I rose, my chains clinking softly, a sound that soon turned into a rhythm, a rhythm that became a song, an old hymn my grandmother used to sing, a melody woven into the fabric of my being. And as I sang, the walls seemed to tremble, the air growing lighter, the shadows receding. Days later, they dragged me from that cell, my body weakened but my spirit unyielding. They released me into the streets, expecting to see a man broken, a man defeated. But instead, they saw a man reborn. Word spread of my release, and the people gathered in the square, their faces lit with a fire that mirrored my own. Elders, children, mothers, fathers, all stood together, a tapestry of strength and solidarity that no force could unravel. And I realized then that the awakening was not in my words alone. It was in the hearts that heard, the eyes that opened, the souls that remembered their place in God's story. We were not just survivors, we were chosen. Africa was not a footnote in history, not a people forgotten in the annals of faith. We were the bearers of a light that had never been extinguished, only hidden beneath the weight of a world that feared what it could not understand. And as we stood together, the sky painted with the colors of a setting sun, I knew that the river had been crossed, not just by me, but by a people reclaiming their inheritance. The awakening was here, and there was no turning back. As I stand here, the winds of change stirring through the streets, I can feel the weight of our shared journey. It's not just mine to carry, but ours, yours too. You who walk beside me in this world of shadows and light. You who hear this call, this message of truth and awakening. The world will try to silence us. It will try to twist what we know and keep us in the dark. But I tell you now, as one who has crossed over into the eternal and returned, that we are not here by accident. We are chosen, each and every one of us. We carry the flame of a heritage that was never lost, only hidden. So I ask you, will you stand with me? Will you rise and claim your place in God's plan, no matter the cost? Will you remember that you are not alone, that your heritage, your roots, are deeply tied to something far greater than any struggle you face in this world? The time is now. The truth is yours to carry, to share, to pass down. Do not let fear silence you. Do not let the world tell you who you are. You are His. You are ours, and together we will rise to the destiny that was always meant for us. Let the world see us, not as scattered, broken people, but as a living testament to His power, because we are not done yet, we are only beginning. And the greatest chapters of our story are still to come, so I ask again, will you walk with me? Will you embrace your calling and let the light of our heritage shine brighter than ever before? The choice is yours. Choose wisely.